Hi, John. Great to see you again.
Welcome.
Yeah. So, John, I guess today we're wanting to cover off some of the things that are happening in the market around consolidation.
Yeah, well, look, certainly on the vendor field, we've got, as you're aware, one major sort of consolidation, for better or worse, and that is the numerous acquisitions. And I saw there's another one, Prospero or something,
Today.
by Latera, who've, from memory, just doing a mental tick box, they've taken whoever owns Latera, because there's about 10 companies they've purchased, maybe more.
Yeah, HG Capital, I think, they've got Latera.
Yeah, and what that actually means is really for the clients. Yeah. I don't think it's a great win, because if you look at the product consolidation that goes with it, in many respects now, the only company you can go to is Latera, because they bought all the competition. Now, there may be other competitors out there in some niche market, which I don't know about, but I think in certain areas which I am familiar with, you've only got one choice now, Latera, and I know they seem to have dropped Microsystems, so it's purely Latera now. And I don't necessarily think that's a great thing for the market, because my view, and this is shared by many people because I've asked them, is that what happens in these circumstances is when there's an acquisition, your prices inevitably go up, service goes down, innovation goes down. So that's not necessarily a great thing for clients. The other thing with this Latera is that, with the acquisition of companies like Duckett, you're very familiar with, what you get, you decrease the service levels that have been offered in a market like Australia, because I don't think Latera has a particularly great interest in the Australian market. And look, to some extent that's understandable, because comparison with US market, we're quite modest, right? But if you look at, again, with Latera, Duckett, which would have been their major representation out there, we both know that they've lost a lot of people. Maybe they'll recruit others, but I think the perception in the market is that it's not here. They had somebody out here who's no longer with them. They had Workshare, having taken over Workshare. The people from Workshare, as we both know, have gone to other things. So I don't think that's great for the Australian market, and probably not great for the market in general. There are other mergers, acquisitions, which have an impact. I don't know. Well, in the services side, there's one in particular. And again, talking to heads of IT, they're very disappointed with the change in the service they get from being able to deal with the smaller company, where the key people and have a conversation and get the service they'd like to expect. Now it's much more formal. You log a call, it gets whatever that process is. It starts to be like ringing somebody like, well, in my case, Qantas constantly and getting fobbed around, or Telstra, right? It lacks the intimacy that we were perhaps used to. So I think that's pretty disappointing.
What's the way around it? I guess this is what's actually happened, but what's the way around it? What things could actually happen to make things better? What's the solution to it?
Well, look, we know that acquisitions, consolidation is inevitable. It's not just purely in situations that affect legal. But I think the change has got to be at the top and the culture of the business. And that's very hard for clients to influence. And it's, so if you look at the original Latera with Deepak and the people he had, that was to my mind, a great company, right? They're really great people. Nearly all have gone, unfortunately. because it's a different culture and different motivation. And, I think if you've made these acquisitions, you want to realize that by making, increasing revenue, making greater profit, right? You've got bills to pay. And I think that changes. And I think when you're being acquired by financial companies that want to make quick dollar, well, that's where the focus is going to be. And the client inevitably suffers. I don't know what can be done about it, to be honest, because
I guess, and sorry to jump in there, John, but there's something is there a role in Australian law firms backing Australian technology further? So what I'm thinking to myself, we've got incubators. You've got people that are actually from a legal industry looking to create, looking to solve problems. And basically what happens is there's backing from these firms in some sort of way, in either buying the product or basically, whatever else. Maybe it might be financial, but is there a role, do you think, in the industry itself, maybe supporting ventures that offer alternatives?
Well, I think people, innovators, etc., should be hopefully supported to some extent by the local market, whether it be directly by law firms or whatever. But again, if they're successful, then inevitably they're going to sell out. And why shouldn't they? They've come up with an idea. I mean, you and I have both seen this, right? They come up with an idea, they develop something. If it becomes reasonably successful, what are they going to do? Because there's always going to be a competitor, and it's probably the competitor is going to be have somebody with more money, and they sell out to the competitor or sell out to somebody, or they risk, losing their market eventually. So I think it's a take the money and run thing so often.
Is that a function of the fact there not enough investment locally from venture capitalists, private equity companies in those sort of scaling ventures?
I think the part of the problem is historically it's very hard. Again, this just doesn't apply to legal, but it's very hard for Australian startups to gain market in, say, the US, to establish itself in the US, which is usually the go-to, right? It's very hard. So having somebody buy you with the money, who's got the money to really try to establish in those markets, I think there's that level of inevitability about it. So, starting up, getting the money to actually make a go of it is terribly important. But long term, can you sustain that in what we have as a modest market? You need to expand if you're going to try to, grow your company, and that can be moving overseas, being acquired by somebody bigger.
Well, if you look at what the ACI group have done, it's quite incredible. Great success story. They started off in Australia. They've actually gone globally, acquired businesses and that sort of stuff. Is there room for another? Is there room for another one of those where I guess it's got the backing and where some prominent high net worth individuals or venture capital funds or private equity just dump some money into a fund and say, here's 10 businesses that have got these ideas around document automation or around security, around whatever there is around that whole professional services industry.
Oh, I think if you've got a good idea, it's viable, that you will get financial support. But what that does to the company itself inevitably will mean there's a change in culture. I think, and I think, look, there are success stories out of Australia, we know, that retain a certain Australian identity. Yes. But I think they're probably few in number. When it comes to, really growing outside of, and we've had, the odd failure. Look at both you and I remember Solution 6, which got very greedy and acquired lots of business. Acquired lots of businesses and suddenly, founded because, well, there are other reasons, right? But it just collapsed. So
Yeah.
there's always that risk as well, that you can grow, I guess, beyond your means. So I don't know what the answer is particularly, but I think it's very difficult, as I said, for a startup in Australia, particularly in legal, to grow to a large extent, because the market prevents that. So you've got to go overseas and try to break into the US market or UK market, but inevitably it'll probably be the US market. And look, there has been some good products come out of here in legal as well. I mean, but one area, for example, that is a very fragmented area, which is the document assembly space, which you and I have been talking about recently. And again, just looking at the survey results, I mean, and again, that sort of 30-odd firms, there's a real variety of products available being used.
Yeah.
And there's nobody really established a dominance in that space at this point. And that there are other companies that are not even represented, or very poorly represented in that space at this point in time, where they're trying to get into this market. But one of the acquisitions that we know about, I mean, poor old hot dogs, well, maybe you shouldn't say poor old hot dogs, but once we're part of Lexus, as I recall, I remember their history, became independent, were bought by some financial company, and it, immediately changed their go-to market there and their commercials. And really, if I could use the term, pissed off their client base, got a lot of resistance. And we know from experience that other companies, and Express Docs as one, immediately started trying to get in and take over their clients, not just in Australia, I'm sure, because they saw that opportunity that Hot Docs was not looking after their client base well.
Yeah.
And again, Hot Docs may be marginally, in our survey, have the slightly higher number of clients, but I tell you, it's not much. There's about 6 or 7 different products being used within those 30 firms.
So if you had a really great idea and you developed a bit of software and that sort of stuff, and basically you had 1 or 2 firms that you're friendly with to get software in there, I mean, how would you grow that business in Australia? How
would I try to sell it in Australia?
How would you try and grow that business out and things? I mean, is there a pathway for people with great ideas that have kind of like, proven a minimum viable product, they've proven it a little bit and they want to prove it more and build their market share out? What advice would you give to people with that in that situation?
Well, you need a product that appeals, that hopefully addresses a gap that hasn't really been covered that well by existing products. And you've got to promote it. And look, a couple of examples come to mind. XREF, which is bought by Microsystems, which was bought by Latera, or the new Latera thing. Okay, XREF was an interesting product. I think it was fairly new in that space. There was maybe one competing product. They visited Australia, went to legal show, to conferences, etc., promoted the product, and were relatively successful in attracting law firms to buy the product, at least just trial the product and to buy licenses. The other one that comes to mind, and to be honest, I don't know quite how successful they are, but they seem to be doing pretty well, is Checkbox. We both know that. They appeared twice, I think, at our conferences, and they had somebody selling it. It looked appealing. I'm sure they'd like to think they've been doing pretty well. So that's a local company that I think has been comparatively successful. I mean, again, I haven't spoken to them for a while, but so there are ways, if you make the effort, prepared to invest the time to establish, I guess, yourself in this market.
Yeah.
but in some spaces, it's, it's really hard. Checkbox, XREF, they were, I'm trying to think of a way to describe them without sounding derogatory, but they were niche products, right? I mean, they're not, it's not like, say, a practice management system, which is a major investment, not only in dollars, but, cost of implementation, etc. If you've got a niche product which can appeal and deal with, which is not terribly competitive, I think you're in with a chance. Because I think legal, well, it's a bit of a contradiction in legal, isn't it? They're trying to innovate and automate process.
Yes.
But the problem, and while they will tell you that, the problem is the lawyers, particularly the elderly lawyers, maybe the more established ones, because the contradiction for them is that they are charging for time still. And if you automate process, the challenge is if you automate too much, you don't need lawyers so much, right? And if you're a senior lawyer with a practice group and you can see, well, if great technology, but if I use this, if they even think about it, but if I use this, I'm going to maybe decrease my billings.
Yeah.
That said, we know that in certain spaces, property and finance, insurance, etc., that because it's transactional, that's really where automation is changing legal. Because to compete, they've got to implement automation. And when you automate a process, what do you then look at the people who are doing, your staff? You don't need lawyers totally. I mean, to do some repetitive type tasks, you need some like a process worker, somebody that ticks the boxes, make sure things done. And then you've got the lawyers to sign off the matter, etc. So that's where, and that's hard for law firms to change, to accept the fact that the old model just doesn't work quite so well anymore.
Yeah.
But again, clients drive that because it's competitive.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's very interesting. Be good to have be good to have at some point in time, I guess, a segment whereby people, have 5 minutes to present their legal technology solution on a forum like this, whereby there's a bit like a Dragon's Den type scenario where they've sort of got a bit of critique and people can actually view it. They can look at the products, they can get an appreciation of what they're trying to do and where they're at, because I think there's a lot of people out there who deserve a good start.
Oh, absolutely. But sometimes the technology that's presented, and I'm thinking of one particular one, which eventually was bought by Laterra in the original Laterra, and then got dropped when they became acquired, was it looked good, but ultimately the technology that it was developed with wasn't really so great and had to be redeveloped. So things can be showy, but not necessarily behind the engine behind the scenes, maybe not so great. But look, I think it's the fact that there are ideas about how to do things is also equally important. The technology, how it's developed, can always be improved, but to come up with some idea, which should necessarily come from lawyers, right? Because they're the ones dealing with the potential problems. You can get the smart people to develop it, but you've got to have the concept first and believe that there is a space for that product to develop and be successful.
Absolutely. No, I totally agree. I think that's what you do need to have. Well, John, always a pleasure chatting with you, and thank you so much for your insights today. And look forward to sharing with our viewers and audience.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for the time, and we'll speak soon, perhaps as early as next week.
Brilliant. Thanks, John. Thanks.
Okay,
John.
mate. Cheers now. Bye.